Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be here today and hearing about all the wonderful work that's been going on and is going to be happening within the Life in the Universe Centre. So my perspective is very much that of a biologist and paleontologist, trying to understand what life is on Earth and what it has been, because that is the only example we have at the moment. And so if we starting to think about life on other planets, we need to start here on Earth. And life on Earth is really so incredible. We have such a wonderfully diverse range of different creatures, from our turtles and jellyfish to the more kind of bizarre fungi and carnivorous plants. And these all add together in these really incredible ways to make very, very diverse and different ecosystems, such as our tropical rainforests and our coral reefs. But the question really is, would this wonderful diversity of life exist on other planets? Would we exist on other planets? So in order to understand this, we need to understand the evolutionary processes that led to us here and how they work. And in order to understand evolution, we need to understand the evolutionary history of life on Earth. That is, what's happened to life here on Earth over the last 4 billion years. So when we're starting to think about the evolution of life, we often start thinking in terms of biological transitions. So how are we going from RNA to DNA, and how we're going from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells, for example. But if we're starting to think about whether life exists outside our own Earth, we can't really focus on these quite small details because, with the potential exception of sample returns from Mars, we'd never be able to detect them on other planets, these kind of organism-level changes. So instead, we need to think about things differently. We need to start thinking about things from a planetary perspective. So when we're thinking about life on Earth in the forms of planetary perspective, we're thinking not in terms of the biological transitions, but the ecological transitions. So what are the innovations that life went through that had a fundamental effect on the biosphere and changed the Earth as we knew it forever? So for us, we're going to focus on 4 transitions. We've got the origins of life, back at around 4 billion. We've talked a little bit about interdisciplinary work and trying to work between different departments. Something I discovered chatting to Madhu is that physicists will take 0 at when the Earth formed at 4.5, whereas geologists and biologists start here. Very important to get that clear in your head. So yes, when I'm talking about animals at 600 million years ago, for example, I'm not talking about 3.9 billion years ago. I'm talking about quite recent. So we have the origins of life approximately 3.84 billion years ago. And then we just have microbial life. For 3 billion years, there's not a lot going on. But what we do get is oxygenic photosynthesis, which massively transforms our biosphere, creating oxygen levels. Then we again have a big period of stasis before we get animals appearing around 600 million years. And this again massively transforms our biosphere, because as they start to move around, they have the ability to change their own environment and make it better for them, easier for them to live. And that leads to an increase in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere again. The other major transition we need to think about is the invasion of land by life in the form of land plants, which again massively transform our habitat, changing the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And then right at the end, we've got our humans and our ability to change our own environment for better or worse. But when we're starting to think about all these different transitions, the question really becomes, is this pattern that we're seeing of these big periods of relative stasis with kind of quite a lot of change right at the end, how normal is this? If we look on life on other planets that are similar age, similar properties, planetary properties, will we see the same sorts of patterns progress? And we can think about that in terms of how predictable is evolution. So when we're thinking about predictability or inevitability of evolution, we have to start here on Earth. This is the only example we've got. And as we're very aware, life evolves through natural selection. Organisms that are better adapted to their local environment are more successful, they reproduce more, and those are the ones that then survive and excel and go on to conquer the planet, so to speak. And what's interesting is something we're very familiar with, is the body plans often converge on similar sorts of patterns. So given an environmental constraint, we see the same sort of body plans emerging. And these can occur over many different sorts of major groups, like these the mammals and the birds and the insects all have wings, as well as our pterosaurs from like 200 million years ago. Now, these can also happen on very short timescales. So we've got this really nice, well-studied example of anole lizards in the Caribbean, where we see the same sorts of features evolving independently across multiple islands. So different groups of lizards will evolve different sorts of leg lengths, depending on where they are on the tree, and different sorts of amounts of paddedness of their toes. And they're doing this because they're adapting to the same conditions. So what it makes it feel is that evolution is quite predictable. We have environmental constraints, and life adapts to it in a fairly predictable way. And what it makes it feel is a systematic adaptation of life to the environment means that essentially what we've seen before us in the history of life on Earth will happen elsewhere. But this isn't necessarily the case. There are exactly some really fundamental examples of macroevolutionary patterns which can be explained without using this kind of systematic deterministic response to the environment, and instead can be explained by probabilistic models that don't actually involve the environment. So the example I'm going to talk to you about on this one is about the first animals. So these are fossils that are found around 600 million years ago during the Ediacaran time period. And these very, very early animals look very different to pretty much everything else alive today and elsewhere in the fossil record. So while they look superficially like plants, because they're found in very deep water rocks, we know that they're not photosynthetic. And what this means is because they're very, very different, we don't have any modern analogues with which to compare them to, which makes studying them rather hard. However, fortunately, the preservation of these Ediacaran organisms is really exceptional. So we have thousands upon thousands of these fossils preserved under volcanic ash. And it's quite like Pompeii in that everything was preserved as it was living. And what that means is we have this multiple censuses of Ediacaran life. Now, because we've got these snapshots, perfect snapshots of Ediacaran life, it means we can use these quantitative ecological approaches in order to study them. The sorts of things that are only normally applicable and useful in the modern world, and apply them back to these first animal communities 600 million years ago. So what me and my group have been doing is using these sorts of quantitative ecological approaches that involve entire communities in order to determine what the driving factors behind the evolution and dynamics of these communities are. And what we found was really rather surprising. What we found is that actually these communities are very much driven by stochastic dynamics. They're not systematically interacting with their local environment, and they're not systematically interacting with each other. So this is very, very different to what we're seeing nowadays. If you think of something like a coral reef, the environment is massively important. The way the different organisms interact with each other and fight for space is very much what's driving the diversity and driving the dynamics. And this isn't what we're seeing right at the start of animal life. It's very, very different. And what this is suggesting is that these early animals weren't systematically adapting to their environment in a predictable, deterministic way, but instead, potentially what their evolution is driven by is just random chance differences within the populations, and only very, very limited environmental influence. Now this, we then see changes actually throughout the Ediacaran. As you get into younger rocks, you see a greater influence of environment on the dynamics of these organisms, and a greater ecological complexity as you start to move towards the Cambrian and more familiar animals. But why is all this relevant to thinking about life elsewhere? Well, it matters because when we're thinking about these big biosphere or ecological transitions, we don't know whether the time and even the presence of each one of these is a result of this systematic evolution, or indeed by random chance. So why on earth have there been these very, very long periods of stasis, particularly between the origins of life and animals, or oxygenate photosynthesis and animals? So does this mean that as animals, we are actually really bad at evolving, and elsewhere on planets, potentially we could be evolving much, much, much more quickly? Or is it the opposite? Are we actually really lucky to be here at all, and it was fluke chance that we managed to evolve? And so this is sort of thing and sort of approach that we're thinking about in terms of biology within the centre. There are two particular aspects that we'll be dealing with. The first one is trying to think about where we'd be in terms of biosphere complexity, in terms of these different phases of history of life on Earth, when we're looking at habitable exoplanets and trying to make predictions about what sort of levels and what sort of biosignatures we'll be seeing. And the other thing that we're going to be thinking about is when we consider lots and lots of different biosignatures of lots of different sorts of varieties, and using eco-evolutionary models to integrate this and assess the likelihood of these different probabilities of all these different changes that we're seeing when we're looking across multiple different exoplanets. And it's very much these kind of really fundamental questions in evolutionary biology that makes the kind of biology aspects of the centre quite so interesting. So thank you very much.
On Earth, there's a clear bifurcation between animals and plants. Could you have just plants without animals, or vice versa?
Well, we start getting, when we think of plants, we think of trees, but actually half of photosynthetic life is in the oceans, right? And that becomes well before we get animals. We have a lot of photosynthetic life. We have a lot of macroalgae before we get animals. So yes, conceptually, to me at least, you could definitely have complex kind of macroscopic photosynthesizing organisms without necessarily having animals. Not sure where that would lead though, but that's an interesting thought.
Super interesting. Two brief questions that relate to each other. So you have these big changes that are happening in sort of the environment, and at the same time you've got these big influxes in new species. Do you know which comes first? Which is the horse and which is the cart? Does the change in environment drive the change in evolution? And in the same sense, it's sort of part of the same question. Is then the driver for evolution the ability to change rather than being in tight competition? So if you have a new environmental niche, does that drive evolution through drift rather than the conventional way we think about evolution in the sense that you're fighting for resources? So if you have new resources, does that drive evolution, basically?
The first question is, I would say, life drives environmental changes rather than the other way around. So very much so, we get this massive rise because of oxygen photosynthesis. I would also argue that we get rises in kind of global oxygenation because of the animals, not due to them.
Species that drive the change in the environment predate the big change in species that are present, right? So you have cyanobacteria that are generating oxygen in the atmosphere. That then changes the environmental niches available, and then do you then get the big burst in evolution?
So you don't 2 billion years ago. What goes on, I guess, in detail here, which is what I'm very interested in, is actually really interesting because you might expect the second you get animals to get this massive explosion of species, right? But you don't really see that. You see this tiny, tiny, tiny little kind of very gentle slope of diversification. Then suddenly you get the Cambrian, it goes massively up. And so it's not intuitive, at least to me. You'd expect that if you've suddenly got the ability to live in an ecological niche that nothing else occupies, you just go crazy. But actually, if you're unrestricted, you're not having those selection pressures really that drive most of evolution. So actually, it's not this big boom that you might expect straight away. But then, 100 million years it kicks in.